Hey, I guess it's been a while, but back. And I guess I should probably explain where I've gone before I get started here. I have moved to college. So uh hopefully with the changes to my schedule, things are actually going to be consistent with uploads, but I don't know if that will be the case. Regardless, I have another video that I've decided to put out, and yeah, here we go. So today we're going to be talking about encounters, and we're going to be trying to find a way to make encounters more challenging without making more creatures or higher CR creatures. Instead, I want to look at player classes and player abilities that make the encounter more challenging without making the encounter difficult. And I want to make a clear difference here that the difference between a challenging and a difficult encounter is a challenging encounter is not meant to be significantly dangerous, but a difficult encounter is kind of like having a deadly counter versus a matching encounter, I guess, or like a even footing type idea. So there's going to be a couple different options that I'm going to present today, and those options will be adding class features to monsters, modifying monsters, and giving monsters full class levels. And I know this has probably been done before by a couple people, but I want to make it clear that I have a way that I do it that I think should be discussed, at least to present another option for people who are just trying to design encounters. So first off, let's look at adding individual class features to a monster. All right, Dungeon Master hats on. We're going to look at 3 fairly low level CR monsters that a typical adventuring party would counter at lower levels. And we're going to use these for all 3 examples of our various types of features that we're going to be adding to 3 monsters. And we're going to use these creatures for all 3 examples, but I figured I'd introduce them now, that way I don't have to repeat everything later. So we're going to be using a goblin, an animated armor, and a hobgoblin captain, and we're going to be designing each of these with a separate class feature, and then I'm going to use an example that ties them all together. And I've picked out our class features that we'll be using. Alright, so the 3 options for class features we're going to go with are 2-weapon fighting, divine smite, and sneak attack. Now, I'm probably going to be using these in a little bit of an unorthodox fashion, as some of you may know where these features probably should be best used, but I have a different idea for them. Now, the goblins are the first one to start with because they're the easiest. We're actually going to give them 2-weapon fighting. Now, that might seem a little counterintuitive considering they're goblins, but I think that it not only sets them apart from standard goblins, it also makes them a little more dangerous, because even +1 or +2 to a little bit of damage would mean that they are much more dangerous than your average goblin, especially if they manage to get a hold of 2 weapons. Next, let's look at the animated armor. Now, between divine smite and sneak attack, I'm actually going to give it sneak attack. Sneak attack means the armor has an ability that it can use from stealth, which it has an innate ability to, considering that while motionless, it's indistinguishable from a normal suit of armor. So I think giving it a base level sneak attack, or even an extra slightly upgraded sneak attack to even 2d6 might be a really good option. And last, if we move to the hobgoblin, obviously we're going to give it divine smite, and that means it's going to have spell slots, but it can only be spent on smites. And I think the default paladin option is good enough, 1 maybe 2 first level spell slots to give it a damage buff at a critical moment might be a big deal, especially if you have something like a raging barbarian directly in your face. So now that we have our features designed, let's put an encounter around these creatures. Alright, so for an encounter, we're going to assume that the players have entered this castle and are assaulting the goblin warlord on his throne in the throne room, which is the room on the right. And they enter. There are 2 armor stands flanking the wall, one of which is our animated armor. It will remain motionless until combat. We have 4 goblin guards, each wielding 2 short swords, and our goblin captain, or hobgoblin warlord, whatever you want to call him, who is wielding a holy sword that the players are required to retrieve, which is giving him access to divine smite. So, when the players move into said room, There'll most likely be a confrontation with the goblin and the hobgoblin. Initiative will be rolled, and hopefully the animated armor goes first. Roll stealth to see if it gets surprise, and if it does, it'll immediately go for a sneak attack on the closest character before joining combat as normal. It may not get sneak attack up often, but maybe potentially causing serious damage would be enough of a threat to the characters to set them on edge, potentially making them rethink their strategy or even move out into a wider area where they can make use of their ranged attacks. None of these enemies will have range attacks themselves in order to compensate for their buffs due to boosted weapon damage and such. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the implication of modifying monsters. And we're going to use the same monsters as before, our animated armor, goblin, and hobgoblin. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be changing a small amount of their capabilities in order to make potentially a different encounter that could be considered more challenging. So let's look first at the animated armor. And one thing that would be a really simple modification is simply changing what the creature type is. And now as like an animated armor, it doesn't make a lot of sense because typically they're a suit of plate mail or similar that would require them to be a construct. However, I think it'd be very interesting if an animated armor was more of an elemental, or perhaps is an undead in the suit of armor, which you could consider an undead typed creature. That might surprise players, is because now you're dealing with something that is still an animated armor, but now it acts differently because it is a different creature type. An undead has much less self-preservation and is more inclined to just wail away at you and be probably a little simpler, but still could cause some serious damage if it knows that it can, if it stays still, it can ambush you. For the goblins, let's assume instead of making a basic goblin, let's make them a little more beefier by upping their constitution score. And let's make them a little faster by giving them that standard 30-foot movement speed. Now, this might be a little powerful, but even one higher modifier of constitution, making their hit points even a few higher, might make the difference between them surviving a hit or not. And that faster speed means the players can't outrun them, so they can keep up with you regardless of your situation. For the hobgoblin captain, I think it would be an interesting idea to give them a new type of proficiency, for example, firearm proficiency, or a different weapon that they are proficient with, in order to change up the encounter, since most of the time hobgoblins wield long swords and bows and that sort of thing. Making monsters that have their own features modified in just a little bit of a way that makes them different than a normal encounter could change the challenge without making the monster significantly more difficult. Finally, we're going to be putting class levels onto monsters. Now, I think with this sort of thing, you should look especially at what type of classes would be actually viable on a monster, because some of them just don't make any sense. For example, a lot of spellcaster levels are fairly iffy on monsters unless they already have spellcasting themselves, and it's not typically a good idea to put class levels on a monster. However, something I do want to point out is if you do put class levels on a monster, that will affect their hit dice as well as most of the time their armor class. Especially things like barbarians or monks, they will be forced up an AC, and if their hit dice are higher, their hit points will bump up somewhat, making them a lot more dangerous potentially. So, as a warning to anyone who does put class levels on a monster, make sure you balance it accordingly. If you do that, and then you don't have to worry about making something that's too strong or more of a boss fight rather than an actual short encounter. Even doing this in any sort of encounter, limit it to one, maybe two creatures, especially if it's a large encounter. That way you don't end up giving 30 goblins with barbarian levels to a party that could potentially cause a TPK within a couple rounds. So less of why I think you should do this and more of if you do this, there's a warning involved, but make sure that if you're going to do it, you know what you're doing. So yeah, there we go. That's what I think about the subject, and I think that making monsters more challenging without bumping up CR is always really fun, because that way you can still challenge your players without really having to make them worry about more and more dangerous monsters. And it gives old monsters a little more flavor. So thank you for watching. I'm signing